And Trump, who told us he was coming into office to make peace, turns out that he's coming into office as a continuation of the war machine.
So recently, Jeffrey Sachs went on Judge Napolitano's podcast to talk about the Trump administration's policy toward Ukraine, including its recent decision to continue supplying Ukraine with more weaponry than it already had been. He also gets into the ramifications of this, the prospects for peace in that theater, and why U.S. policy toward Ukraine, despite all the rhetoric, never changes regardless of administration. He's one of the best geographical and geopolitical analysts that I've ever seen, so let's see what he has to say. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
You have argued so articulately that foreign policy doesn't seem to change. There's that one-liner, no matter who you vote for president, you end up with John McCain. Here's somebody who fully agrees with you and said so on May 30th, 2017. Chris, cut number 7.
I have a certain perspective. You see, I've already spoken with one U.S. president and another and a third. Presidents come and go, but the policy doesn't change. Do you know why? Because the power of the bureaucracy is very strong. So someone gets elected, comes in with their own ideas, and then people show up with briefcases, well-dressed, wearing dark suits like mine, but not with a red tie, more like a black or dark blue one. And they start explaining how things should be done. And everything changes right away. You see what I mean? This happens from one administration to the next.
For those who are listening to the show and didn't recognize those words as translated, it was Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia. He's 100% correct, Jeff.
Look, he said in this interview with the Figaro in 2017 that it's interesting for him. He said, I've dealt with 3 presidents and they actually come in with ideas. But then those ideas disappear because the men in the dark suits and the briefcases, that's the CIA, by the way. That's the other security agencies. That is the Pentagon. That's the armed services committees and so forth. That's the big donors. They come in and they say, no, Mr. President, you do it this way. Now, we've just witnessed this exactly happening with Donald Trump. And Donald Trump ran on a campaign of making peace. He was going to make peace here and there. He was going to make peace in Ukraine. He was going to make peace in the Middle East. He doesn't have perhaps the knowledge, but he certainly doesn't have the guts.
Yeah, I think this is right. There's no doubt this really, shows and demonstrates the power of the deep state and the intelligence apparatus, the propaganda machine propped up by the CIA to sell these wars, but also how the state entities and the government ties in with the lobbies, and especially the military-industrial complex, the Raytheons and Lockheed Martins that are pushing for continued war for lucrative profit ventures, and also the banks that are benefited enormously by America's debt that they accumulate by engaging in these wars. It's why people say all wars are bankers' wars. I have to agree with that, especially since the inception of the central banks. We've seen that happen. So, yeah, this is exactly accurate, and it doesn't matter who's saying it. There's lots of dissidents that say that in the United States. So whether or not you're agreeing with Putin, it sure seems to be the case that there's an alarming amount of continuity in U.S. foreign policy between administrations, despite all the theatrics and all the ideas that we're witnessing, a grand clash of personalities and ideologies, and we can never have Harris, we can never have Biden, we can never have Trump, we can never have Vance. Despite that, all the policy does seem to be the same. So I'll have to default to what Napolitano mentioned, my good friend's quote, Tom Woods, when he said, no matter who you vote for, you always get John McCain. And I think we've seen that in Yemen, Iran, and Ukraine right now in this administration. I hate to say it, but that's what seems to be unfolding.
To make peace, because to make peace, you have to go against the CIA. You have to go against the military-industrial complex. You have to say they're wrong. They've made terrible mistakes for 30 years. Well, on the campaign trail, that was easy, but Trump doesn't have the gumption to stick with it. So to make peace with Russia is straightforward. You have to say clearly the NATO enlargement to Ukraine was wrong because it provoked a conflict with Russia. You have to say that publicly. You have to say that it was wrong for the United States to help overthrow violently the Ukraine government in 2014 to bring in a NATO-friendly regime. You have to say that publicly. To say that publicly goes against the U.S. deep state.
I totally agree with this. I think that we actually would be, our government, a respected negotiator if it laid these things on the table. If it said these things were wrong, we want to try to get away from this policy. We want to disengage. We don't want to include Ukraine in NATO. That's what Putin's always asked for, going back before this time. It was the reddest of red lines, according to a memo written by William Burns, I think in 2009. Might have been 2008, to Condoleezza Rice. He was the neocon ambassador to Ukraine at that time, reporting to Condoleezza Rice and saying, hey, I've talked to all the political factions here, and they disagree on a lot. But one thing that they don't disagree on is that Ukraine can't be in NATO. That is the reddest of red lines. If it is included in NATO, that's a serious offense, and it will be met with some kind of military response. That's essentially what the memo said. It's eerily prophetic. And without Julian Assange, we'd never have that memo to see the duplicity that was involved in these expansionary activities, but also overthrowing the democratically elected government of Yanukovych in Ukraine, and then having the nerve to say that that was for democracy, that the US and NATO were doing that. Jeff's exactly right. That's what it would take. But that's only the first step. You'd have to give up continued funding in this war to stop this war. Trump doesn't seem to be willing to do that. Quite to the contrary, he seems much more willing to embrace the strategy of Lindsey Graham, dump in more aid and more weaponry, despite the fact that this war is going nowhere. There's essentially been no territorial changes, but hundreds of thousands and millions likely of deaths.
Trump obviously doesn't have the guts to say it publicly. To make peace in the Middle East, you have to say that Israel can't murder, starve, and ethnically cleanse millions of Palestinians, and that in fact, Palestine needs a state so that it is not under the militaristic and murderous control of Israel. You have to say that. Well, it's very straightforward from a policy point of view, but to say it runs against the CIA and Mossad and the military-industrial complex.
Yeah, that's right. When it comes to Israel, too, saying that you prefer a two-state solution, and by the way, I don't believe in many political solutions at all, if any, but they're much more palatable to me than any kind of war solutions, or, I'll just put that in quotes because it doesn't really solve anything to empire build and to support the genocide in Gaza. But, it seems so extreme now after October 7th somehow changed everything. But what we've seen from Israel since then, I think vindicates the position more than any other time in history that Palestinians need another state. And it has been, the policy put out there by U.S. presidents in the past, like Carter and Clinton, and I believe Bush, and I believe Obama, to support a two-state solution. But now it just seems to be thrown by the wayside because the Likud party and the neocons have overridden any kind of tendency in that direction.
It takes guts. It also takes, attention. You can't have attention deficit disorder in your foreign policy, where it's one day this, the next day it's tariffs, the next day it's a ceasefire demand, making demands. Oh, Putin doesn't listen to my demands. Well, the United States has not been clear at all about what needs to be done. And it's interesting, all of this talk, for example, in Ukraine, of a ceasefire is an escape from talking about the real issues that are at stake in Ukraine, about NATO enlargement first and foremost. You see, Trump won't talk about that. He's afraid to. That runs against the U.S. deep state. Every president has been afraid to for decades. We are run not by these presidents, but we are run by the CIA, by the military-industrial complex. And if I might, because you rightly brought attention to Putin explaining, I've seen this show before. That was in 2017, and he's experiencing it exactly again with Trump. Now, we should recall the most famous words about this by the president who was perhaps best equipped of all our modern presidents to understand this. And of course, that was General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the commander of the Allied forces in World War II. And he was the one, famously, that warned us exactly about this in his farewell address to the nation on January 17th, 1961. And if I might just quickly quote it, because I wanted to show his words are so prescient. He said, "This conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in this American experience. The total influence, economic, political, and even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihoods are all involved. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist." And that was 1961.
Yeah, hard to disagree with that and hard to be against that now. It sounds eerily prophetic because that's exactly how things have turned out in this 70 years since he said that, or 60 years since he said that. So, yeah, we're paying the the price for embracing the alternative path, and that is setting up our economy and our war machine around the idea of a military-industrial complex, the idea that it will rise to prominence in terms of influencing our politicians, our deep state, and our president, and getting us into these forever wars, these regime change operations, proxy wars like we're facing in Ukraine right now. It's just tragic in so many ways. It's really a slap in the face to the founders that warned against the danger of entangling alliances, said Washington in his farewell address, warned against entangling alliances that Jefferson talked about in his first inaugural address, and how unfortunate America would be into that position where they'd be just full sail, full bore supporting these entangling alliances. The one thing I'll say about Sachs I might disagree with a little bit is the ceasefire is not really, the idea of a ceasefire doesn't really evade things to some extent when it comes to this theater, I think, because when Trump and Ukraine pitched a ceasefire and Putin responded to it, what Putin said was essentially all the things that we would need for a ceasefire are the same prerequisites that we would need to end this war entirely. They didn't seem to want to embrace the idea at all, and obviously so, because that would give the Ukrainians time to replenish their supplies and weapons, etc. And Russia doesn't want that. Russia seems to want to end this thing and secure a peace. They have been willing to do that in the first months of this war, even in Istanbul. Zelensky didn't take that advice, but there's a track record there that that's what Russia wants. So I don't really think that that's escaping anything, but I would much rather see, rather than a ceasefire, a complete conclusion to this war. I'm just not sure that it's possible at this point, or at least on this trajectory.
Right. We are run by the military-industrial complex. Trump is a sideshow. What Trump has done in recent weeks with Ukraine, with the Middle East, with China, with Epstein tapes, with all of it, is just fall into line as presidents are supposed to do. MAGA is, turns out, it's a campaign slogan, of course. It's nothing new. It's a continuation of the deep state. And the deep state has led us to one war after another. Yes, military stocks are soaring. The Israeli stock exchange is soaring. Can you believe it? Israel's at war. It's disrupted. But the war profiteers are making a fortune. And this is what runs the American show now. Not Trump, not Congress, which is irrelevant, not even a sideshow.
Yeah, Congress defers a measurable amount of its power that it's supposed to have under the Constitution to be able to declare wars. The sole entity that should be able to declare wars, not the president. it's just alarmingly deferential to the president on those matters, despite the fact that you do hear some dissidents on both sides complain about this when it happens. Recently, you heard Thomas Massie say, hey, this is an unconstitutional military strike against Iran. You also heard that from Ro Khanna, that also made the same points. But those people are few and far between. Most of these folks are won over by the lobbyists that doesn't exactly care whether the strike was unconstitutional, because they know it will mean benefits for Raytheon and Lockheed Martin, and AIPAC's all on board with this too. Whenever the enemy of Israel is involved too, they'll do anything to get U.S. representatives to be as supportive as possible and send as much cash as possible into the coffers of Netanyahu to support those things.
And the Supreme Court, by the way, has basically said to Trump, yeah, you do whatever you want. We're not going to stop you. So we have the ability, completely out of control of the military-industrial complex, to run our nation. And it is. And that means war nonstop.
Yeah, hate to say that's true.
How close are we to World War III?
We may already be in it. The problem with World War III is that there will be no historians alive afterwards to understand when it really started. But if we were in a conventional era with conventional weapons, and there would be a world war and it would be devastating, but there would be a history afterward, maybe the historians would say World War III started in 2014, or maybe 2019, or maybe 2022. Maybe we're in it already. The late Pope Francis often said we're already in World War III. There's no will in the political class to talk about peace.
Yeah, I actually really agree with this as a historian and, author of several books, and, someone that's really devoted a lot of years of my life to studying, especially the founding era to the Civil War. There were many junctions in history at which point it wasn't known at the time that a world war was unfolding, or a war in general was unfolding. I'll just give one example. The founding fathers didn't necessarily think that, the Stamp Act crisis in 1765 would, spill over into a long-lasting conflict with Britain. And there did seem to be some ebbs and flows there. But even the patriots that took the field at Lexington and Concord in 1775 probably didn't think that this would be the start of a war. In many regards, some people thought that would go down as kind of an obscure rebellion isolated to Massachusetts alone, whereupon other colonies wouldn't be supportive of it. And some people were really pushing for it not to be supported by other colonies at the time. But we know that ended up being essentially what most people consider the first shots in the American Revolution or the American War for Independence. And the same thing may be true here. He might be talking about the 2014 coup because that might be seen by historians looking back on this, if there are, that was the start of World War III. Now, I hope that doesn't happen, especially in this theater, because it involves nuclear powers. The two nuclear powers with the most nuclear arms in the world. That's what we most hope doesn't happen, but I'm with Jeff if that's the case, and we do have a world war with nukes. What's left will not be pretty. If there are people left to write about it, it will be, fantastical tragedy witnessed by all corners of the earth. And there's no such thing as left and right and Republican and Democrat in a nuclear winter, by the way.
You don't hear peace anywhere. And Trump, who told us he was coming into office to make peace, turns out that he's coming into office as a continuation of the war machine. And he's tired of Putin, and he's blah, blah, blah this, and he's calling out the Ayatollah. This is all propaganda nonsense, because we don't have a serious policy of diplomacy, of negotiation that gets to the core issues of why these conflicts exist and how the United States should live peacefully alongside Russia or the Arab states or Iran or China, which with some common sense and some prudence and some honesty and some historical knowledge would not be hard to achieve. But instead, we have a revving war machine. And as Eisenhower said, it has changed everything. It's non-stop war.
Yeah, I hate to say that I agree with that, but like I said, throughout this video, our foreign policy seems to be the same regardless of who you elect. That famous Thomas Woods quote that's I hear often repeated. A lot of people don't seem to know that it was him that originally created that quote, and that's fine. But the mentality is the same. No matter who you vote for, you always get war. He said John McCain, but that's emblematic of war because there was never a war that John McCain didn't support. Same with Lindsey Graham, same with the neocons. And there's immense neocon influence in the Trump administration. And if you're going to say, oh, hey, all the neocons are dead because Irving Kristol's dead and Norman Podhoretz is dead, well, I'm sorry to say that their posterity and their influence on the current political class is still tangible. And you see that in this administration, just as that you saw it in Biden's administration. And that's what we're getting. We're getting a betrayal from Donald Trump on this. He campaigned on disengagement in Ukraine, in some conversations, and ending that war in 24 hours. And I think even his most zealous supporters couldn't have fully taken him seriously on that promise, because that would be amazing. But hey, the country's seen crazier things like the Iran hostage crisis essentially ending in the just hours in which Reagan was being sworn in. And lots of conversations involving that believe that Reagan had already kind of arranged for that, his campaign. I haven't looked deeply into that. But, crazier things have happened. But Trump hasn't even put this government and this administration on the path where that is even a possibility. He's done the exact opposite by supplying Ukraine with more weapons, including Patriot missiles, in a time in which it seems like there's less progress on the Ukrainian side than there ever has been before. I'll even say in the early years of the war, Ukraine did make some inroads against Russia, but that all seems to have stopped by at least the late months of 2024 and early months of 2025, where, Ukraine had an offensive in, I believe, July of 2024, and it was just pushed back. And despite all the weaponry and all the money dumped into Ukraine, that's not changing. Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson all remain mostly under Russian control. Russia controls something like 85% of the Donbass right now. And none of this has changed anything. All of Zelensky's ploys to try to say, hey, we captured Chinese soldiers fighting against us for Russia, to try to get to Trump's anti-Chinese sensibilities and send more weaponry. The stunt in which they used a drone strike against Russia's nuclear bombers that basically changed nothing on the battlefield. No matter what he does, this is all ploys to continue the idea that this war is somehow winnable from some endgame perspective on Ukraine, when it's not even clear. They won't even point out what our endgame is. Is it retaking all the Donbass? Is it retaking Crimea? It becomes more and more utopian and more just more and more being readily able to be dismissed by those who actually analyze this war and think about it. But I do want to hear from what you guys think. Let me know in the comments below. Is Jeff Sachs correct about this? Is the continuity striking between administrations? Is there anything that makes you believe that there is a potential path to peace despite the recent decision by Trump to arm Ukraine to a greater extent that it even had been armed? Let me know in the comments down below. Please do like and subscribe to this video. Subscribe to Judge Napolitano too. And please consider becoming a YouTube member by clicking the join button below. You will support the channel financially, and I'd really appreciate that. But by doing that, you also get access to see all my videos on YouTube before they go live to the general public. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. I'll catch you in the next one.